So you've just bought the Archetype frame and want to build a digital setup. Here's everything you should have. SpeedyBee F405 mini stack, 4 VCI motors or something equivalent, SpeedyBee ELRS receiver, DJI 04 Air Unit Pro or the 03 Air Unit also works as well, and of course the Archetype frame. Before touching the electronics, we're going to start with the frame, specifically the base of it. Then we can move to mounting the electronics later. Opening the box, first you'll see the aluminium parts. Set this aside and you'll see 3 boxes. The first will have all the hardware needed for the build, like screws and bolts. These will be labeled and we'll reference these throughout this build video. The next box will have all the 3D printed parts, and the next will have your carbon fiber plates. And this is where we're going to start the build. So first, take your bottom plate. This will be the one that has this little notch here. Take 4 10mm countersunk screws and put them in the armholes. Make sure this recessed area here is facing down so the screws fit flush. You'll have 4 arms in the pack, 2 with logos and 2 without. Grab the one that points forward with the logos facing down. With the notch on the bottom plate facing away from you, place the arm onto the screws. Do the same for the next one, but this time it should be facing back. Now find the keystone and place it between these arms. Slide on the left arms and make sure they're facing the correct direction. The keystone is designed to brace the arms, so if it's a tight fit, just wiggle it in till it all fits flat. Okay, now grab the middle plate, again with the recessed area facing down. Place it so that the threads line up with the screws here. Now you should be able to tighten the screws and they will sandwich the arms to keep everything secure. Grab 4 more M3 10mm screws and place them into these countersunk areas on the bottom. This is just to keep everything a bit more secure in flight. Now we're going to add the standoffs. These are the green aluminium rods here. You'll notice that there's 4 short ones and 2 long ones. The short ones go on the upper bottom plate and the long ones on the lower. Using more M3 10mm screws, secure all of these standoffs. Next, grab the 2 front plates in the box and they will be positioned like this. You'll need to use 4 M3 5mm screws to attach these plates. Now there's going to be 4 30mm M2 screws. These are to hold the electronics, so place them into the holes that form this little square in the middle. You're going to get M2 bolts in the pack. I recommend using these to screw these bolts solid into the frame. This is optional, but I recommend doing it for sharper flying. With the base of the drone built, let's get into the electronics. If you have the SpeedyBee F405 Mini, it should look like this. Grab the ESC board. This is the board that controls the power to the motors and from the battery. You can recognize it because it always has 6 pads on either side for the motors and 2 big pads on the back for the battery. Now in the SpeedyBee pack, you should have this cable. This connects the 2 boards. So we're going to plug it into the ESC board now and then mount it onto the frame with the plug facing down. Now we're going to start by soldering the power leads on. This connects the battery to the boards. In the Archetype pack, we've included 2 leads perfectly cut to the right length for this build. All you have to do is strip both of them about 5mm on both sides to expose the cable. To do this, I like to snip around the insulation and then pull it, that way you're not going to accidentally cut any wire. Now let's start on our first solder. To solder 2 parts together, you need to do what's called tinning. This is melting solder onto each connection first, so they join together properly. So set the temperature of your iron to 400 degrees Celsius. On the power pads, we're going to add a blob of solder. You want to try to melt the solder with the pad and not the iron directly. That being said, you could briefly touch it to get everything flowing. Do this to both sides, and then you want to tin the cable using the same method. And now to join these parts together, just place the cable on top of the pad and push down till both solders melt and combine. Now you just want to repeat this with both cables and make sure that the cables are facing downwards because you want them to run along the top of the carbon plate. And the last thing we're going to do is attach a capacitor. You'll find this in the SpeedyBee pack. We're going to start by cutting it shorter and we want to add some cable to these, which you should have in the Archetype pack. We're doing this to position the capacitor near the front of the drone since there's more room there. So place it face up and you want to add a blob to each leg and join it like this. You need to cover these solder joints since there can't be a risk of these touching. So you can either use electrical tape like this, or if you have some heat shrink around, use that. Now cut the length to 50mm, then strip and tin the ends. Now this is actually going under the ESC, so temporarily remove it and flip it upside down. We're going to add a blob to the underside of the battery pads and wire the capacitor in, making sure the negative side is going to the negative and positive to the positive. Now it should look like this, and now we can mount it back onto the frame. Okay, now let's attach the integrated battery port. First, place it upside down. You want to tin these terminals, being very generous with the solder. It's worth noting that you don't want to heat it up too much because you don't want these terminals to move. Now tin the power cables again, and attach the battery port in the same method by pushing the iron down into the joint. It's important to make sure that the curved side of the battery port goes to the negative side of the board and the flat side goes to the positive. Now grab the 3D printed antenna holder and place the mount inside. The curved side should line up, if not, your ESC might be upside down or you've soldered the wrong polarity on the battery pads. So if this is the case, double check these things. Use the 2.5 8mm screws, screw the port in, and slide it over the standoffs. The battery cable should now sit pretty flat on the carbon plate. If that's all good, then let's move on to the motors. The first thing we're going to do is attach the landing gear to each arm, and you'll notice that all the motor holes will line up with this. Remove the motors from the packaging, and use 4 M2 8mm socket screws to attach them. Now to help organize the motor wires and to protect them during flight, we've included wire covers. So thread the motor wires through these, and use the adhesive to attach them to the frame. Now every motor has 3 wires and a corresponding pad on the ESC. So in preparation, let's add a blob to every motor wire pad. Okay, and now we get to the tricky bit. Take the innermost wire on the motor, and we're going to wrap it around the screw and gummies and cut it shorter to make sure there's no loose wire. Strip the end, tin it, and attach it by pushing the iron down on the joint. The next wire is going to be the same process but cut slightly longer so it sits behind the first one, and then follow the same process with the third motor wire. At the end it should look like this, and if you replicate this with every motor, you'll end up with a clean layout like this. Moving on to the next step, grab the second circuit board from the SpeedyBee pack. This is the flight controller and does all the computing of flying. When mounting this, make sure this arrow is facing up and forward. Now there's 2 things we're going to wire into this. The air unit and the receiver to receive controls. But before we get started with that, let me catch you up to speed with what you're looking at. The first thing to note is there are multiple pads that have voltages like 5 volt or 9 volts. You also have what are called UARTs. And a UART is a set of 2 pads, one for receiving information and one for transmitting information. Think of these like USB ports. Alright, now let's start with wiring in the air unit. Unbox it, and the module is going to go in the back like this with these ports facing the front. In the Archetype kit, there'll be 2 sets of spacers. We're going to use the silver, shorter ones. Grab 4 M2 10mm screws and slide it through the holes in the back of the frame, and then add the spacers on top of that. Now this is a little fiddly, but if you put the air unit on top of this, you should now be able to tighten those bolts, and the module should sit just above the power cables. Now there's 4 screws on top of the air unit. Remove these and open up the top plate. Some air units have the camera already pre-installed. If yours isn't like mine, just plug that in now. And while this is open, we're also going to install the antennas. I'm using a single antenna for this build, so I'll push it through the middle hole and thread it through between the power cables. Plug the antenna ports into the air unit, and keep in mind it doesn't matter which plug it's going into, as long as they're both on. If you have a double antenna, the process is the same, you're just going to use these antenna mounting holes. Alright, so with that all secured, put that top plate back on and screw it down, making sure you're not pinching any cables. Now we're going to route the camera between the 2 boards, so remove the top one temporarily. Place the camera cable down and close it up. Again, make sure not to pinch this cable while doing this. In the Archetype pack, you'll have 4 locking bolts. Loosely put these on now to keep everything together. Alright, now we're going to connect the 04 to the flight controller. So add a blob to ground, R1, T1, ground, and 9 volt. These cables don't have to travel very far, so you can cut these down to 30mm. We need to strip these cables here, but with these smaller ones, you can just use your nail to grab the insulation and then pull it off. Now we're going to wire the cables from left to right because sometimes the colors can be a little inconsistent. I've also put a wiring diagram here, so make sure to refer to this first. So the left yellow cable we actually don't need unless you're using a DJI remote, so put that one aside. The second from the left black one, let's solder that one to ground. Then the grey, which is the third from the left, to R1. White to T1. The next black one to ground, and then red to 9 volt. With the VTX module done, let's mount the camera. Now there's going to be 2 sets of camera mounts in the pack. For this digital setup, we're going to use the green ones. So push them into the sides of the front plate, remove the pre-installed screws on the 04 camera, place the camera into the frame, and then reinstall those screws. Okay, now let's move on to the receiver. In the pack you'll find the board itself, an antenna, wires, and a bit of heat shrink. Add a blob to all the pads on the board, and add the black wire to ground, red to 5 volt, green to TX, and yellow to RX. On the flight controller, add a blob to the ground, 5 volt, R2, and T2. Again, the wiring diagram is here, but black to ground, red to 5V, green to RX, and yellow to TX. Now, slide that heat shrink on the receiver, but pull it down to the cables. Take the antenna and thread it through the rear of the drone and in between the power cables. The antenna will sit nicely in the holder like this. Take the port of this antenna, plug it into the receiver, and slide the heat shrink over. Now you should find a small double-sided tape tab in the Archetype box. Place this on the VTX and the receiver on this to keep it secure. Now let's do a quick test to make sure everything is working smooth. So I just want you to look over the connections and make sure none of them are bridging and are connected to each other, and double check that the capacitor's negative side is going to the negative pad and the positive to the positive. Now I'm using a smoke stopper here, so if I plug the battery in and there is a short, it will cut the power, that way nothing gets damaged. So let the power through, and if it does this, then everything is working as expected. For diagnosing purposes, it's worth knowing that the first set of beeps is the ESC, and the second is the flight controller. Alright, now let's pair the drone with the remote. When you first turn it on, the receiver should go straight into pairing mode. If not, plug and unplug the battery 3 times like this. It will now start blinking like this to indicate it is now in pairing mode. On the remote, hit Menu, Express LRS, and scroll down to Bind. It will take a few seconds and then it should bind. On the home screen, it will now have these bars to indicate it's paired, and the receiver will now be solid red. Now, just a few final things. Take a match and bring it close to the receiver with the heat shrink on to keep it all together. And now put the top plate on and just secure it with 1 screw for now. Now the build is done, we need to configure it in Betaflight now. So plug it in using the flight controller, and near the connect button you should see update firmware. Now the first thing we're going to do is update to the latest version. So in this section, hit auto detect on the board and select the latest version. Make sure all of these settings are the same, and we're going to remove a few of these options since we don't need them. Hit load firmware online, and once it downloads, hit flash firmware. It's going to prompt you to create a backup, and make sure to do this just in case the update fails. It will take about 2 minutes, then we'll be ready to start adjusting the settings. Once it's complete, hit connect. It might give you a warning, but just ignore this. Now what we're going to do is work our way down these settings on the left here. So first, make sure your drone is responding to the physical movements, then place it on a flat surface and calibrate the accelerometer. If it's not responding correctly, it means you didn't fit on the flight controller on straight, but if you need to, you can change this here. Next, go to ports. Now this is very specific to your board and how you wire it all together, but if you followed this tutorial, do the following. Serial RX is the receiver. We soldered this to RX2 and TX2, so it's going to be UART2. So make sure this is selected. Next, let's tell it which one is the video transmitter. We used RX1 and TX1, so that's going to be UART1. So turn on configuration/MSP, and under peripherals set VTX MSP plus DisplayPort, and then save and reboot. Now in configuration, set the craft name and pilot name, and under receiver, you want to make sure the drone is responding correctly to the inputs. So throttle up moves the throttle, and check yaw, roll, and pitch. If it's not responding correctly, play around with the channel mapping. This changes what stick inputs are seen as. I've put a few other common channel maps on screen here, so if your one's not working, try one of these. Alright, next let's look at the modes. This is where you assign functions to certain switches on the remote. I'm going to show you what I use to fly, but feel free to assign them how you like. Now first let's start with arming. This is spinning the motors to start flying. And the first thing you want to do is hit add range. Then you want to flick this button. You can see it moves this little notch as you click the button, and this section inside the bracket is when it's on. So move this so the notch falls on when you press the button down. Next is angle or self-leveling. Hit add range and put that on this 3-level rocker. And set it to the middle. Set horizon on the same switch and set it to all the way up. If neither of these flight modes are on, your default is going to be acro or manual mode, and this doesn't have to be assigned. The next function is flip over after crash. This will make the motor spin in the opposite direction, and I put this on the second rocker with it all the way up. Alright, next we need to configure the motors. For this, plug your battery in, making sure props aren't on. Click motor direction reversed, and then hit reorder motors. What you're going to do here is just tell Betaflight which motors are spinning when prompted. Once you're done with this, click motor direction, then select individual. What you're going to do here is spin each motor, and if it's spinning in the correct direction as outlined in this diagram, then you can leave it. If not, click reverse. Sometimes it's hard to tell which way the motor is spinning, so I like to use a prop without the adapter so it sits loosely on the motor, and then when you spin the motor you can see it a little bit easier. And finally, we're going to set up a simple OSD, which is the text you'll see on the screen when you fly. So go to OSD, select battery voltage and average cell voltage, and position them around this location. Hit save, and then use a small pin to hit the bind button on the air unit. And then on your goggles, make sure O4 Air Unit Pro is selected, and press and hold the power button, which will enter it into pairing mode. It should take about 10 seconds, and then they should connect. Double check through the goggles that you can see the visuals, and that you can see the battery voltage. Finally, screw down the top plate with M3 10mm screws for the standoffs, and two M3 5mm screws for the front plates. And now you should be ready to fly.